Hello everyone. In this video, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the writing process and then specifically how you can integrate more of a growth mindset into your writing process. So, as many of you may be aware, there are 5 basic stages of the writing process. So there's invention, research, drafting, revision, and then editing. Now, first of all, it's important to understand that those aren't linear. A lot of times people think that, well, this is the order that I follow, and I must follow this order, and this is how writing works. And you may follow that order, and that's, maybe a good place to start. But it's important to understand that you will often spend time circling back, especially I find during the revision process, for example. I have to sometimes go back and do more research. I also find that I have to sometimes go back and do more invention, and we'll talk about some of the things that you do during those stages. But first of all, the important thing I think is to understand that it's more kind of circular than linear. So that's something to keep in mind. Next, of course, just a brief summary of those 5 steps of the writing process. So, first, in invention, that is really where you are digging in and coming up with ideas. This is where you'll do pre-writing strategies. Some people like to outline, and that works really well for some people, especially on longer projects. Some people like to free write, where you just write out as much as you can. I think it's also important to add a rhetorical aspect to your invention stage. And for me, that involves really studying what genre I'm working in. So, for example, if I'm writing a traditional research paper, I will look at examples of traditional research papers. If I am writing an article for a magazine, I will go and read samples of articles from that magazine. If you're working on your dissertation, you want to look at examples not only from your field, but also from your school. Different schools will have different requirements. So you want to make sure that you're spending time really studying what you're being asked to write as a part of invention. And then, of course, comes research, and this will depend on, the level of research that's required for your project. A lot of times this will involve really digging into the academic databases. The next step, of course, is drafting, and this is where you just write. And it's important to understand, I think, and this is really where that growth mindset comes in. When you draft, if you are trying to make it perfect, it will really inhibit your ability to draft. And we don't want that to happen. So I think if you can try, and this is a process, and I will have another video on growth mindset later, but if you can try to remind yourself that when you're drafting, this is just a first draft, and truly it's okay if it's messy or it needs to be reorganized, because you're going to have revision that's going to come later where you can deal with that. The important thing is understanding that we all have things to work on. We all have ways that we need to grow as writers, no matter where we are, from the professional writers to the high school writer. There's always room for growth and improvement. And so if you can just accept that and say, okay, I know I need to improve in some way. I know it's not going to be perfect, and I'm just going to write. I think that you will find that, number one, it's very freeing. And number two, it will help you learn. You can't learn until you've made some mistakes. You can't grow until you've tried something and then see how it went. And so when you're drafting, try to really embrace that growth mindset. Then, of course, comes revision, and that is where you are just going to start picking it apart. A lot of times I find that students confuse revision and editing. And editing, which we'll talk about in a minute, is the surface level stuff. Revision is the kind of stuff where you read it through and you see, oh my gosh, there's a hole in my research here. I've got to go back and do more research. Or I really struggled with this idea and making this come out clearly. How can I completely reword this? And then if you're like me, revision often involves cutting. When I draft, I have to allow myself to go long. I have to write out everything that comes to my mind, and then I have to come back and cut. And sometimes that can be tough, but what I have found is that if you are really open, again, it kind of goes back to that growth mindset about letting go when you revise. I think that you will find that you give yourself a lot more room for growth. And when you give yourself that room for growth, it often equals growth. So revision is probably, I think, in my opinion, if not the most important, at least like up there in terms of being the most important step in the writing process. And it's one that a lot of students forget. And then finally is editing. This is where you are going through and you're making sure that your APA format is correct, that your sentences are clearly punctuated, that things are capitalized properly, those kinds of things. You want to, of course, and this is, I would say, one part where it's a little bit linear. It makes sense to do really thorough revision before you dig into the polishing of editing. But whenever you dig into editing, it is, I think, important, again, to embrace that growth mindset, because a lot of times you're just going to miss stuff. And you have to understand that that's okay. That's because you're human. And in fact, because we're human, our brains are so good at reading through errors that, it's kind of like we're too good to be good editors. With that said, you want to use tools. So you want to make sure that, you're using the grammar checker in your word processing program, that if you have access to Grammarly is wonderful. But keep in mind that none of these things are perfect. So they're not human, and that's their weakness. Our language is complex. There are things that these softwares just don't have the ability to pick up on. And I think, understanding that is kind of empowering. So use the tools, question the tools. And then I would say, in terms of really, really editing, oh, yay, here's my kitty making an appearance. In terms of really editing thoroughly, if you can read your writing in reverse, like if you need something to be super duper polished, read your writing in reverse. And this is what I have to do when I need something to be super duper polished. This is Betty, by the way. Betty, kitty, kitty. Anyway, so those are my strategies, advice, kind of embedded into the summary of the writing process. I hope this is helpful to you. If you have any questions, just let me know. I'm happy to help. Again, I think the most important thing is to understand that as a writer, you're going to engage in a process, and you'll have to find a process that really works well for you. I've gone over the basics, but you want to make sure that you're doing things at each level that fit well with the way you work and the way you grow. So thank you so much for listening. And again, just let me know if you have any questions.